You've probably heard a little something about the federal government's debt problem, and you're probably wondering how we got here. Well, every year, the federal government takes in a certain amount of money through taxes, fees, and other revenue. And every year, the government pays for things like national defense, highways, education, Social Security, Medicare, etc. When the cost of those expenses exceed the incoming revenue, you have a budget deficit. So in order to pay the bills, the government must borrow the difference, which they do, from individuals, businesses, governments, and other organizations. This is the national debt. Like a credit card with a credit limit, the federal government is authorized by Congress to borrow what's needed to pay the government's bills, as long as the total borrowing does not exceed a certain amount. We call this the debt ceiling. The problem is that the U.S. government runs a deficit nearly every year. These annual budget deficits have added up over time, increasing our national debt. In order to pay the bills, the president has asked Congress to raise the debt ceiling, and throughout our history, Congress has generally said, okay. In fact, since 1962, Congress has passed 74 separate measures to raise the debt ceiling. Thanks to President Obama and congressional Democrats, federal spending exceeded revenue by $1.6 trillion last year. This was the largest deficit in our nation's history. In order to pay for all this deficit spending, Democrat leaders passed a debt ceiling increase of $1.9 trillion, the largest single increase in the debt ceiling ever. In fact, since President Obama took office on January 20th, 2009, the national debt has increased by $3.7 trillion, and the total outstanding national debt has exceeded $14 trillion. To put that in perspective, it took the United States from 1776 until 1992 to accumulate the same amount of debt that President Obama accumulated in 2.5 years. We're going to have to check this out, but this has to be a record too. The president is now requesting that Congress raise the debt ceiling again in order to continue spending and spending and spending. We have hit this point not because the debt ceiling is too low or we don't have enough revenue, but because their spending is just too high. House Republicans don't want to add to our debt, but are willing to raise the debt ceiling to meet our country's previous obligations, but only if the president agrees to cut up the credit card, stop the spending, lower the deficit to bring down our national debt, and enact true reforms to ensure our nation's prosperity. Did I mention China? I probably should have mentioned China.